We do have a quorum, all are present. The Committee of the Whole meeting, the purpose of our meeting today is to receive and the Planning Commission recommendations in regards to solar farms. The purpose of this meeting today is only to receive information, and no decisions will be made as a result thereof. One decision that will need to be made is to talk about scheduling the public hearing time and place, because a public hearing is required. Following that public hearing, then the commission will be charged with making a decision in regards to the recommendations that have been made by the Planning Commission. Due to the requirement that there has to be public notice for a period of time, the public hearing probably will be somewhere about 30 days from now. So that will not be an immediate next week issue. So at this time, we're open to receiving the information from the staff. I understand our consultants will be virtual. And so anyway, Mr. Jay Leipzig, Director of Planning, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Jay Leipzig, the Planning Director. I'm pleased to be here today to present this work to you. What we'll be discussing will be about almost a year's worth of work discussing utility scale solar and review by the Planning Commission, work with our consultant, looking at other solar facilities, and gathering as much information as we can about these type of facilities. I want to make a couple of brief introductions and some thank yous while I can here for just a moment. I was going to introduce Karen Miller. Karen is our senior planner, and some of the newer commissioners, you probably don't see Karen as much. Karen is a very, I think she's been with the department about 26 years, has been our primary focus is long-term comprehensive planning, and is kind of our specialist for doing regulations and comprehensive plan amendments. So we're pleased to have Karen involved in this project, and also Sean Penley. And I think you see Sean Penley every week at a various meeting. So I'm pleased to have them up here with me this morning, and I want to thank, or this afternoon, I wanted to thank them for the work that they've done. And in my 25 years, 26 years of planning, this has been a very challenging project, and it's one of the more complicated ones that I've been involved with. And we're excited to present these regulations to you. I also wanted to introduce our consultant, Darren Coffey, Michael Zahner, and Lindsay Edwards with the Berkeley Group. These folks have been with us since we had an introductory meeting in January, and there was a committee of the whole before this body in March of 2021. But I wanted to thank them for their work in getting to this point. And what you're looking at today are really best practices on a national level, best practices from a land use perspective, as well as the utility industry and some of their knowledge and expertise in putting these together. I also wanted to point out and thank Rick Lynn from our legal staff, Peg Trent for the countless hours that they've spent reviewing these documents and making sure they're in good order for you today. I believe we've assembled a good team that should be able to answer all of the questions that you might have this afternoon, including Bovier, sorry, I knew I would make a mistake on that name, is here as well if there are questions about that. We also have Public Works representatives as well. If there are questions about roads or infrastructure, be happy to answer those as well. So as I said, I think we have a pretty good team that is assembled to be able to answer all the questions that you might have. You have quite a few documents in front of you. I wanted to point these out in your packet so you're aware of what we will be discussing and kind of a framework for the discussion today. We have a PowerPoint that provides a high-level overview for you and a summary of the regulations. There's also a memorandum that's dated February 22nd from me, Sean Penley, and Karen Miller that provides more detailed explanation of the recommendations from the Planning Commission. So if there's some additional background in that material you might find helpful, that's about a 4 or 5 page document. And then we also have the draft regulations themselves. And the regulations include amendments to our comprehensive plan, which is here in front of me, as well as our amendments to our subdivision regulations, the draft amendments. So this document is roughly about 72, 73 pages. So that is all of everything in its entirety that we'll be discussing today and that we've been working on for the past year. So with that, as the chairman just noted, the purpose today is to really provide a more detailed explanation, go through what the amendments are and the proposed regulations in regard to utility scale solar, and talk about those, answer the questions that you might have in this regard. And so, in summary, as I mentioned, this really encompasses a lot of work, and I also want to thank the Planning Commission for their countless hours in going through these documents. And the Planning Commission meets on a regular basis on the fourth Tuesday of every month. We've had 5 regular meetings, January through September of 2021. We also had 3 study sessions, August and October. And there was public comment that was available at all of those meetings. So we've had 8 meetings of the Planning Commission. We also had a public hearing scheduled on November 16th, 2021, and then the Planning Commission made the recommendation on December 14th of 2021. So we've spent a significant amount of time studying this issue and reviewing the best practices and working with staff and the consultant. So as we said, mentioned, this item was brought before you on March the 11th of 2021. We had a committee of the whole. It's kind of an introduction, and I believe the consultant was there for that meeting as well to introduce the topic. Today, the study session, or the committee of the whole, today we'll have a public hearing that will be announced shortly, sometime in the future. But that kind of provides an overview of where we are, but we did want to spend some additional time making this presentation before you, so we have some time to study this issue. Okay, the first part we're going to talk about are the comprehensive plan policies, and I'm going to provide a brief introduction, and Karen Miller is going to provide more detail on the comp plan amendments, and then Sean Penley is going to also provide additional detail on our subdivision regulations and what those proposed changes are. As you know, this Rural Comprehensive Plan is our guidebook for the county, so it guides all development, and there are certain priorities and goals that are identified in that comprehensive plan.
Jay, could you pull that microphone a little closer?
Sorry. Okay. Yes, I have a tendency to scoot back from the chair. In that, our comprehensive plan goals are to promote rural character and open spaces, provide for future city growth and development, and protect existing and future residential uses, parks, historic sites, other public amenities, and environmentally sensitive areas. So if you think of these utility scale solar regulations in a nutshell, and their impact, these goals are really how we're trying to integrate the utility scale solar into these goals within our comprehensive plan. So that's kind of a general framework for staff's perspective when we begin to put this together and balancing those needs for the regulations as well as the public's needs and those concerns as well. A couple of other things I wanted to point out. There has been a significant amount of public comment. We have, in response to that, staff has dedicated or created a county, additional county webpage dedicated to solar. There is a link on the front page of the county's website for any documents related to solar are collected on that, so that will all be part of the public record. So I thought that was a very innovative approach to make sure we capture everything in all of that material, and documents are kept in one place and can be archived accordingly.
Mr. Reichcraft, did you have a question?
Mr. Chairman, I apologize for coming in a few minutes late. Are you allowing questions during the presentation or afterwards?
Well, let's proceed through the presentation, and so then we can ask the questions. So simply make notes.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, with that concludes my introductory comments, and I'm going to turn it over to Karen Miller for the next phase of the presentation.
Ms. Miller. Can you pull it closer?
As Jay indicated, we started out by looking at what those unique impacts of this new technology would be, because planning staff hadn't really considered the idea of a utility scale solar facility before. And so we determined that really the important impacts that we would need to look at would be it's very large scale. These can go up to hundreds or thousands of acres, which is far bigger than some of our biggest uses that we've dealt with, for instance, the sunflower quarry. And then also, it's very long lifespan, a minimum of 20 acres, but probably more like, 20 years, and probably more like 30 or 40 years, and even maybe longer because the industry doesn't quite know what its lifespan is. Perhaps they can retool it at the end of 20 and 30 years and get even more life out of it. So we decided that those were the big impacts. And so what we decided we needed to be careful about would be the impacts on the development of cities. We don't want these things to get in the way of the normal annexations and growth outward of the cities. And also, just in general, the preservation of open space and rural character. We looked at all that and we decided, yes, we can have utility scale solar facilities as long as we appropriately control them and find reasonable but effective standards to address these impacts. And so with that, well, first, before I go into the specific standards, and each of the standards that I'll go over today, we've chosen for its ability to regulate these concerns that the county has. But just to kind of talk about solar facilities in general. So typically when a company tries to assemble a utility scale solar facility, in the Midwest at least, they like to use the existing fields in farms because it's perfect for their use. It's already kind of graded, it's kind of flat, it's this area that's readily available for them to come in and put their solar facilities. Now, with such for the larger utility scale solar facilities, they'll need to assemble several of these areas, of these farmers' fields. And so for example, if this is a typical field, they would come in and here would be typically a tree line around that existing hayfield or cropland. And then sometimes there's natural elements that run through, like streams, and then they'd find those areas to put in their solar panels. And we refer to those sometimes as PV panels, which stands for photovoltaic panels. That's the material that absorbs the sunlight and converts it to energy. And so this is a typical configuration. We will have a field, it'll have this natural vegetation around it, and then around these groups of photovoltaic panels, which we call PV pods or photovoltaic pods, these groupings, they'll have fencing around it. We don't want the fencing to go completely around just the ring of the field because that blocks movement of wildlife. So we prefer fencing around these various pods. They'll have driveways come in. And so a utility scale solar facility will typically be a collection of these areas. And I'll talk a little bit more later on about how we measure that project area and when we say a solar facility, exactly what we mean. So the first development standard that we chose was looking at the CUP term. And we landed upon 20 years, and our reasons behind 20 years was that's a typical planning period. So when we create a comprehensive plan, we choose a 20-year plan because typically in planners' experience, pretty much everywhere, we've found that we can kind of predict growth about 20 years into the future. If we start going 30, 40 years, then that becomes, we become less able to predict what's going to happen. Nothing's perfect. Things happen that we don't predict. But in terms of planning, 20 years is something that we generally feel we can do. And we chose a maximum project area of 1,000 acres. And we talked with our consultants, and the consultant said that up to now, generally, a really reasonable area would be 1,000 acres. That would be the upper limits of generally what they had been seeing. Now that trend is increasing. And I'll just make a note, if you look at other jurisdictions and look at their areas, be careful on how you compare things, because I've noticed that some of the really large solar facilities are often in the desert and or arid areas. They're not typically in the Midwest, and also they're not typically near urban areas. So just be careful of that one idea that we have of protecting the growth of our county. And then also, we landed upon this idea of not only 1,000 acres, but a project, maximum project extent, and that limits the geographic disbursement of the solar facility. And on the next slide, I'll look into how project area and project extent interplay and why we have those. And also a waiver is available as written now for the project extent, but not available for the CUP term or the project area. So this is a visual showing what we mean by project area and project extent. So planning staff was thinking about when the business is starting to collect these parcels on which to put these solar facilities, that when you're dealing with hundreds or thousands of acres, it would be very difficult to have a completely contiguous project area. So, and we decided that it would be probably unreasonable to require everything to be contiguous, the whole solar facility. So we decided, we thought, well, what would be reasonable? So it would be reasonable to allow them not to be completely contiguous, but to require them to be at least a half a mile from each other. So in this first visual, the project area, everything in pink, it would be a single solar facility. So the single solar facility would have all of the PV panels, it would have inverters, it would have possibly substations, if any, battery energy storage areas, if any, and all of the landscaping, fencing, all that thing. So the project area has all of that land that's participating in the solar facility. And so we're not making them make them abut each other. We're allowing them to be within a half mile. But we don't want this to kind of devolve into this one solar facility taking up a major portion of the county. We want to control it and have it compacted into a single solar facility. And so in the second visual for project extent, we decided that we could control this geographic disbursement with a box, that all of the solar facility needed to be in a rectangle that's a maximum of 4 square miles. And this is something to allow some flexibility, but also have some control over the solar facility, so we just don't have this random huge area that we would be having to review as one conditional use permit. So the next standard that we introduced was the maximum coverage area, and The reason that we want to control this maximum coverage area is if you think of a solar facility, if 100% of it is covered with solar panels or equipment, we're going to have some trouble with stormwater management. We won't be able to retain all of the vegetation. We'll have trouble with open space. It won't promote the rural character. So we had some guidance from our consultant, and our consultant said that if you have a coverage area of no more than 70%, meaning that no more than 70% of it is covered by those PV pods, then you won't tend to have trouble with all of these things, that you will be able to manage your stormwater much more effectively, and you'll have better vegetation retention and so on and so forth. And then the other thing that we think is very important is looking at the distance from the cities of these solar facilities and providing a protective buffer so that we can account for their projected future growth. And to do this, we reached out to the cities. We have talked with those fringe cities. We invited the cities, whoever would like to attend, to one of our planning commission meetings. The city of Edgerton attended. And then also, instead of attendance, some of the cities gave us letters. And then we were also invited to an Edgerton Planning Commission meeting, and we did a presentation there. So we collected a lot of information from the cities and presented that to our Planning Commission and set upon a 2-mile buffer area, but to be reasonable, to have a waiver option available, because sometimes it would be appropriate to be closer to the cities. For instance, if the city doesn't plan out to 2 miles, for instance, if the city is planning for an industrial area and they don't have any issues with a solar facility in that area. So there's many examples of why it could be appropriate to have a waiver. And so in that waiver option, we would get input from the cities and present that to the Board of County Commissioners, and the board could decide if it's appropriate to grant a waiver or not. But the choice would be up to our Board of County Commissioners. Then another standard that we have is distance from another solar facility. We have at least 2 miles between solar facilities. We thought that was important so that that we could control the proliferation of solar facilities. If we didn't have some kind of distance requirement, then we'd have 1,000-acre solar facility next to another, next to another, next to another, and pretty soon we'd have like a 4,000 or 5,000 acre solar facility. So that is simply to control the proliferation and geographic distribution of the solar facility throughout the county. Setbacks is something that's important to regulate. We started out in our initial discussions with a very conservative setback. We initially recommended 150 feet from the project boundary. We got input from the industry that this was too conservative. We thought about it and we thought, well, what are we really trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish? And we set upon 50 feet from the project boundary. And to give you some comparison, that is currently what any structure in the rural district has to be from the roads in the counties, from the front yard setback. So the 50-foot setback of the solar facility structures from the project boundary is taken from our rural setbacks. And also, just to note that even agricultural barns and other agricultural structures have to meet a 50-foot setback currently from the road. We thought it was also appropriate to have a heightened setback of 150 feet from substations and battery storage facilities from the boundary. And then also, because dwellings are a more sensitive area, we have a heightened setback to dwellings. All of the solar facility equipment and structures have to be at least 250 feet from any existing dwelling. And the setback requirement works in tandem with screening. So we have the setback from that outer project boundary, and within that, if appropriate or required, would be any kind of screening. And so at first, initially, when we started talking, we recommended screening around the entire project boundary. Again, we got some feedback from the industry that it's a little bit too conservative, so we listened, we thought about it, what are we really trying to accomplish? And we identified the sensitive areas of existing dwellings, of existing residential zoning, and views from the road. And so the setbacks in combination with the screening can be protective of that rural character and open spaces, and it can protect those sensitive areas like dwellings. And that screening can be accomplished by using existing vegetation, by adding landscaping, by some sort of decorative fencing, or berming if that's appropriate or desired, and also a waiver is available for the screening requirement. And here's an example of some existing landscaping around PV pods. So each of these strips is like one photovoltaic pod. And then also, you may or may not be able to see it, there's been a row of existing landscaping added. And with that, I'll turn over the next discussion to Sean.
Thanks, Karen. Good afternoon. I'll continue on with some of the development standards that are proposed in the regulations, and then also go through some of the changes with the Planning Commission recommendations, and then talk about next steps. So in addition to all of the development standards that Karen has explained, they're obviously, for solar facilities of such large scale, they, with various types of equipment over large amounts of area, there needs to be guarantees for the eventual removal of this equipment. These facilities obviously are intended to be long-term. Some of these may last as long as 40 to 50 years, or possibly longer. This is a very new development, but it is going to last some time. That's why a conditional use permit is an appropriate form of the regulating process. But there needs to be some guarantees for the eventual removal and reclamation of the site when these facilities are no longer needed. We have standards in place for the decommissioning of the facilities and all of the equipment. That includes all equipment above ground and below ground. There may be conduit or possibly new overhead power lines, but obviously the solar panels and then the distribution equipment. At some point in time, all of these materials, when the facilities no longer need to be removed. So we need to have guarantees in place. So the different types of guarantees that we could have with this may consist of escrow, letter of credit, or bonds. And these funds and these guarantees are to cover a number of things besides just the removal of the equipment. It's also to stabilize the land and reseed and restore the ground to its next use. Most often it will be agricultural uses. That's what most of the land in the county would likely be, is returned to agricultural use. And the zoning in these properties will remain rural and agricultural use. The decommissioning and the reclamation in these bonds will also cover disposal of materials, have to follow all other demolition permitting and disposal requirements. As I mentioned, the forms of credit, the forms of guarantees would include escrow, letter of credit, or bonding. These estimates, what are going to be required for the guarantees would be to include all cost estimates from a professional engineer, and that will be provided at the time of the conditional use permit and staff review and possibly a third-party review. But these estimates should also not include salvage value. That's something in talking with our consultant, we identified that is a common practice in some jurisdictions, that these decommissioning operations may include salvage value. However, we don't recommend that because it's very difficult to determine a value assigned to salvaging or recycling materials when we don't know what that value truly could be. As Karen mentioned, the distance from city limits was an important aspect of the regulations. In talking with the cities, especially those fringe cities, and we'll show some maps here showing some of these examples, we recognize that that was a big concern for the cities, future growth areas, and to not interfere with future growth and development of the cities. And obviously, annexations will have a big impact on that in the future. As the cities grow, these buffers and the areas where utility-scale solar facilities would be developed is very important to look at as the cities are growing, where those annexations will occur. As you all know, the recent annexation in the city of DeSoto for the former Sunflower Army ammunition plant, it was a considerable area, essentially doubling the size of the city, and it included a large area, over 6,000 acres. So that immediately will have an impact on where the utility-scale solar facilities could be located, because we need to be outside the cities and we want to have a buffer. I will note, one of the recommendations in the final, the Planning Commission recommendations we'll go through was for a minimum 2-mile buffer from cities. So with that recent annexation in DeSoto, that does cut down the available land area, the eligible area of land in the county where utility-scale solar facilities can be developed. It essentially will result in about just over 10,000 acres in the unincorporated area for where these facilities can be built. And I'll show some maps here in just a minute. There is a waiver, the Planning Commission did recommend a waiver for that requirement too, I will note. So although there's this minimum buffer, there is opportunities where, if appropriate, a facility could be located within that 2 miles if, let's say, a city did not object to a facility, or if there was good reason for why. Let's say possibly on part of the Sunflower property, maybe if that's appropriate for solar, and it didn't conflict with any other requirements, maybe that's an appropriate place for a waiver to allow that facility. Sorry, I'm advancing with the mouse here. I'm going a little too fast. I'll try to not to advance too fast. This is the map that I was referencing that does show the fringe cities are identified here in this map in light green. And as you can see, just as an example, looking at DeSoto with the Sunflower property, that has included a large area to the south. The 2-mile buffer area is identified in the orange or pink color here. That's representing a 2-mile buffer around all current city limits. And then the bright green areas are those areas that are outside of the buffer in the unincorporated area that would be eligible for utility scale solar. So if we take into account all current city limits, 2-mile buffers, those bright green areas right now are the areas that would fall outside of that 2-mile buffer. This represents an area of just over 10,000 acres in the unincorporated area. I can show some examples too that were what we looked at for different buffers from 1 mile all the way up to 3 miles, and I could show those for comparison at the end. Through the process, as we discussed, through all of these meetings, we've had several comments from the public. There was many people who attended, many people who provided comments, a lot of concerns from residents in the unincorporated area for these facilities. One of the big issues, in addition to the impacts for neighboring properties, was the potential for a non-participating property or a property that's not within the solar facility to be potentially surrounded by a facility. So there's a lot of concern regarding that, and the Planning Commission recommended that staff look at developing standards for that. We did include in the draft regulations, we included a requirement for where a project area abuts a non-participating parcel on 2 or more sides or more than 50% of the property that would be surrounded essentially, then an additional 50-foot setback in addition to the minimum setbacks would apply. So essentially it basically doubles the setback requirements. If a property were to happen to be surrounded on 2 or more sides, they would have to increase the setback and additional screening may be required. So where appropriate, let's say if there was no existing vegetation, maybe they would be required to provide additional trees or other types of screening in addition to that increased setback. This table here represents some of the key development standards that we've discussed today with the CUP term, maximum project area, minimum distance from cities, and setbacks. And it's showing the Planning Commission's recommendations in terms of, at the times when we started the initial draft and staff's recommendations, going through the public hearing and include some of staff's recommendations, and then finally the Planning Commission recommendation to the BOCC, which is the bottom row. So on the initial draft, if we look at that top row, for a term, as an example, for the 20-year term, staff started out conservatively with this requirement. Based on a typical planning period, that's consistent with our comprehensive plan. We look at it generally a 20-year lifespan for major land use impacts. That's an appropriate time where that could be a permitted use for a large facility. However, in going through additional discussions and doing more research and understanding how these facilities operate, they last much longer. The lifespan can be much longer than 20 years. And to be consistent with, the investment of the property and just the overall lifespan, maybe 25 years was more appropriate. And so staff had recommended that at the time of the public hearing. Ultimately, the Planning Commission, in reviewing this, believed that 20 years was appropriate for the term. That was their eventual recommendation. I think it was, again, to be consistent with the comprehensive plan and to review these facilities more often. As an example, in the maximum project area, we initially started out in our initial draft at a maximum area of 1,000 acres, and that was based on our research in reviewing early facilities, early solar facilities. Many of them here in the U.S. were at maximum about 1,000 acres. However, the trend has been growing towards much larger facilities, and so staff had recommended up to 2,000 acres. That could be appropriate if all the standards were in place. But through the process, the Planning Commission ultimately decided that 1,000 acre maximum was appropriate because that would be adequate land area for utility scale solar, and it still balances the needs for the unincorporated area in the county, preserving open space and protecting rural character. Minimum distance, as we discussed, there's the final recommendations for 2 miles, but staff had initially started with a 1 mile buffer. That was just to be respective of the cities and allowing for future growth. Then we pushed it up to 1.5 miles at some of the Planning Commission recommendations, finally arriving at the 2 mile buffer. These setbacks, there actually weren't very many changes in the terms of the setback requirements from the time staff initially started the draft to what was eventually approved. Some of the minimum buffers or the minimum setbacks were decreased. However, we stayed consistent with setbacks from residential from dwellings. That should be a minimum 250 foot. That stayed consistent throughout. There weren't many other changes from the Planning Commission other than adding standards for when properties are surrounded by a solar facility. So finally, just some of the key recommendations, the requirements. As we discussed, the Planning Commission recommended the maximum term of 20 years. And these were changes that we'll recognize here that were from the time of the public hearing to the Planning Commission's final recommendation. Maximum project area was revised from 2,000 acres to 1,000 acres, and the minimum distance from cities changed from 1.5 miles to 2 miles. There are some additional items we wanted to discuss in terms of the next step. As we get ready, obviously this will require a public hearing and a public meeting with the Board of County Commissioners at an upcoming date. There are some things that we have identified that we believe would be helpful to update in the draft language. There are some inconsistencies for medium-scale solar facilities. These would be facilities that would be just large enough to become utility scale, but not the large scale. There's some language in here that we need to revise to be consistent. There's some inconsistencies regarding where battery energy storage would be allowed and what are the requirements. We would like to update that text, as well as providing additional clarifications for street maintenance and repair. This is something that we have identified in consulting with other jurisdictions where they have had solar facilities developed. We recognize that that's a potential big impact to local roads, that during the construction of these facilities, they can have a major impact on roads. And so we need to have strong language in the regulations that would protect those roads. And we want to continue to coordinate with Public Works staff. We think there's better ways we could accommodate that. We do address it in the regulations, but we would like to update that. And then any other revisions to these regulations that are recommended by the board would require remanding it back to the Planning Commission and then a return, of course, to the BOCC for adoption. So that's just kind of the next steps and what we wanted to go through. That really concludes our presentation. I am happy to go through the maps. If there are questions regarding that, we have that in these slides as well, so we can go through the different maps for showing buffers and distances from cities. But I believe at this point, we wanted to open it up for questions and discussion, and as Jay noted, our consultant is also available on the meeting as well.
Jay, let me ask you this. Would you prefer to have the consultants make some comments before we go into discussion?
It's really up to them, sir.
Pardon?
I'm not sure if they have anything to add to our presentation at this point.
Okay. So,
Mr. Chairman, can I make one additional comment?
yeah, go ahead.
Just to follow up to something that just to be clear, when an application is submitted, which should be reviewed by the zoning board, and then that body would make a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners. Each application would include a site plan. So that site plan would show all setbacks, location of panels, everything that you would typically see in a site plan. It would also include a staff review for consistency with the fire code, and looking at ensuring that there's adequate egress and ingress into the property and out of the property. And so this issue with in emergency situations and ensuring that there's access to the site, as well as movement of traffic around it, is important. It would be reviewed with each application. Each application is, if you compare it to something similar to like a quarry, for example, are always very contentious land use applications. This would be something very similar to that. There's a decommissioning process, there's a conditional use permit, there's a term, there's a variety of different aspects that staff would look at when we review the application.
Well, let me clarify, Ms. Miller. The information you presented was a general review by the staff. Is that right? Or I'm just a little confused. Mr. Penley, you outlined the staff recommendation, the Planning Commission final recommendation. That's really the essence of the proposal.
That is correct. Sean Penley, planning staff. Yes, that table that I identified included both some of the original recommendations from staff and then also going through the process, some of the final recommendations from the Planning Commission. The draft that's before you, that's included in your packet, is the entire draft regulations, and that does take into account the Planning Commission's final recommendations.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. Looking at the differences in the recommendations, and we have all received much correspondence, either electronic or otherwise, from constituents, those who support and those who do not support. One of the issues that keeps coming for those who have concerns is that the difference between the 25 years and the 20 years, that historically these investments need 25 years, and yet the Planning Commission recommended 20 years. Can you explain that action?
Yes, that's correct. I think the Planning Commission's recommendations for 20 years came back to the typical planning period of 20 years for the comprehensive plan. But you're correct that in hearing from different experts and different proponents for the renewable energy and for solar facilities, these facilities often last much longer, and the investment that is provided by the utility provider, as well as the land leases that they typically enter into with private property owners, are at least 25 years. So that's what was requested, and in reviewing that, staff felt that would be potentially appropriate. We're going to have a conditional use permit review. These are going to be renewed potentially. If at the end of that term they're still in place, they would be renewed. And so 25 years, I think, is something that a lot of the proponents were thinking would be adequate. And so certainly that's an option. But the Planning Commission, I believe, they just wanted to be consistent with the comprehensive plan.
So the Planning Commission wanted to be consistent with what our current requirements is, which is up to 20 years. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct, sir.
Okay. All right. Question. Other questions? Ms. O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to think back a year ago when we were first talking to the consultants, and when they first were talking to us, I believe that they mentioned that this is unusual for solar facilities to be located in urban fringe areas. in such a robust growth area such as Johnson County? Or was that mentioned by the consultants at that time?
Commissioner O'Hara, there was some discussion from the public about that. I know, though, that in terms of reviewing other projects around the country, and and obviously it's an expanding industry, and so there have been, even in this past year, there's new projects brought online. I was looking at that, so I think that there was some comments from that from it might have even been the public, but I think if you look at other projects that have been built and constructed, it's somewhat, I think we're unique in terms of Kansas in our immediate area, but there are projects, other areas of the country in for example, California and Texas that are in fairly well-populated areas, similar in size and population, but have projects of this size as well. So it's not, and as Shauna mentioned, the trend is for them to increase even currently 1,000 acres, that they seem to be getting larger and larger.
Okay, so with the projects that are closer to growth areas are more like in the 1,000-acre range?
Or more than that even. It really varies. It's if you look at projects even until 3 years ago, were kind of 1,000 acres, were right at where most of them would land. But then if you look at current projects or projects that are proposed, they're all they seem to be trending towards larger amounts. I think our consultant might be able to address some of that as well.
Okay, and then the concern of viability of the project, whether it has a 20-year CUP or 25-year CUP. Actually, the Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners were looking at this as land planning, and that our lens is the highest and best use. The profit motive, that is the concern of the applicant, and really is not our concern. Is that correct?
I think it's a great question, Commissioner J. Leipzig again. The typical lens when we review applications and planning, and it's not just the Johnson County Planning Department, it's throughout the country, is that 20-year period. There's always a 20-year time period. What makes these unique is that it exceeds that. Many of these projects have, most are, if you look at, and I'm just speaking generally, if you look around the country of how they're regulated, they're regulated through a conditional use permit or something similar to what we are proposing. But it seems like those terms exceed 20 years. It's not a, it's just unique from a land use planning perspective, because this project is generally the lifespan of these exceeds that 20 years.
Well, perhaps the consultant can speak to that shortly. Ms. Hensley,
Thank
did
you.
you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a number of questions. I won't ask them all at once. It seems like there's a lot of questions about the actual safety of the facility, the safety of the panels, and I wondered if you or perhaps our consultant can address that, maybe provide some clarification if there's anything hazardous in those panels, because I've heard some concerns about that there will be leaching into the soil. Is there any danger of them catching on fire? I've heard that concern also. And how much of those panels in the racks or the tracking system are potentially recyclable? So I think it'd be helpful to clarify and address those concerns.
Commissioner Hensley, Jay Leipzig, I'll begin to address part of the question, then I'll have the consultant answer your last question. I will say when we conducting our research on this item, we met with fire chiefs and also Anush Vardapur, our county building official, who's an expert on the fire code. We looked at we currently are on the 2018 International Fire Code in the county, and there are provisions in that code that deal explicitly with battery storage facilities and those type of issues. So they're fairly well known. There are stipulations and specifications that the facility would be built to meet the code accommodations and the code requirements. And the benefit there, again, with the International Fire Code, it's a standard that's used throughout the country. So the typical apparatus and the mechanisms within those, they're fairly similar, not standardized, but I think you see the similar equipment throughout the country. So we did look at it in terms of fire code prevention and ensuring that that we had the capabilities to mitigate something like that in an unfortunate event. With that, I'll turn it over to Darren Coffey that can talk a little bit about the environmental.
Karen Miller, can I just add one little extra bit of information to that? Yeah, we worked really closely with Anish Fardapur, and we looked at what was in our 2018 adopted fire code and what had been done after that. And so when we come to a public hearing in front of you, whenever that will be, you'll notice that we'll do a public hearing to adopt 2 standards by reference. And those 2 standards were created more like in 2020 after our codes were adopted. And so those standards adopted by reference will help us make sure that battery energy storage facilities are safer. And so one of them requires the applicant to use equipment that's been tested at the factory and built to a certain standard, and that is to prevent thermal runaway with battery energy storage facilities. And so that means that all of that equipment will be the newest, most up-to-date equipment. And then the other standard you possibly will be adopting is based on just the installation and running of the battery energy storage. So we've looked at that, and we're ensuring that with all of our standards and codes, it'll be the most up-to-date.
And Darren, if you're available, if you'd like to answer the additional question that the commissioner had.
I can't hear.
Yeah, somehow we need a higher volume. Cannot hear you.
No.
Still not there. I'm sorry.
No,
Oh, a little bit.
It's not on your end.
you're about 2 counties away.
Where's Bill
I
Nixon?
was going to say, can you try it again, please?
No, you're still about 2 miles away.
Did you put the microphone toward the,
This is one, it's correct, on Zoom it's very clear. Yeah, and therefore I don't want to yell really loud.
Are you guys having a hard time hearing Maury and I, or can you?
yes? We can.
No, still very, very low.
Try it again, Penny. Nope.
Process of elimination. Unplug it, plug it back up. No, don't do that.
DTI is coming to take a look at it. If you
All
guys,
right.
maybe can we come back
Well,
to this question?
Let's go ahead. Bo, there also been some questions about tax abatements, property value, et cetera, et cetera. Can you fill us in on anything in those regards?
My understanding is this was looking at,
Closer to the microphone, sir, and speak up.
it's over there. There we go. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, so on the tax abatement part of it, I believe this is going to be a TIF project. And typically, those are done by the cities, and then if they're approved, we maintain the market value of them, and the property owner does pay the taxes, which is then given back to the city for reimbursement on their capital gains as they develop the property. That's how that, as I understand, that's how that was probably going to work.
Do I understand that there's some state
Yes.
requirement that gives a break?
The state, I believe, does give them a break as well, but I don't know a lot of the details on that piece of it.
Okay.
That
All
one I know.
I thought it was about 10 years
Yes, there's 10 years on the equipment, correct.
on the equipment. Okay. Ms. O'Hara?
Yes, all alternative energy in the state of Kansas, they are exempt from property taxes for 10 years. It was for as long as that they were alternative energy facilities, but that was changed to 10 years. And I will have to get clarification as to whether that is real estate and equipment, or if it's just equipment. I thought it was real estate and equipment, but I could be in error.
It is actually just the personal property.
It's just the personal property?
Yes.
Okay. And so if it's developed in the county, I don't think we would be giving it a TIF. They would just be getting the tax exemption for the 10 years, similar to IRBs.
So the state, there is direction by the state to promote this kind of activity then, I would assume.
They created a statute to deal with windmill turbine energy, and then the solar started to become popular. They added that into that. I believe that was last year's amendment to the bill.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
I don't know, Jay or Sean or Ms. Miller, again, looking at the differences in the Planning Commission's recommendation to some of the other recommendations, the 1,000 acres, staff recommended 2,000 acres. 1,000 acres would be about a section and a half. The discussion involving that decision, can you enlighten us?
Sure, Commissioner Jay Leipzig again. I will just say in terms of the size, when in the initial draft, was 1,000 acres, that was based on just kind of thinking about what projects and we looked at in the past were what has been proposed. We had further meetings with our consultant, thought that the current trend is that is significantly more than that. But when we were thinking about 1,000 acres, that was contiguous in my mind. As we started looking at and thinking about the potential solar farm in the Midwest or in Johnson County, for example, where we have a lot of natural topographical features, different crops and farm fields and things and different features in that land. Really, the contiguous idea to me, it seems a better approach would have been to expand it to more than 1,000 acres, use the 2,000 acres, but have it be non-contiguous. And that's when we started to develop that idea of the project extent as well. So that is some of the reasoning there, Chairman. I think, and the Planning Commission, the work that they did was just extraordinary in terms of reviewing this and reviewing the proposal. But so they felt firmly about 1,000 acres. I think something that might be suitable would be to offer a waiver on that requirement. Might be something worth considering, but it gives some additional flexibility And if a justification could be made about why a waiver might be appropriate.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up question to that. Are there any other waivers that accompanied the Planning Commission's recommendation or discussion thereof?
Yes, sir. Jay Leipzig, again, there were waivers on the screening requirements. There's waivers on the minimum distance from cities of 2 miles. There's a waiver available on that. But the current recommendation of the Planning Commission does not allow a waiver on the 1,000 acre size, nor the term of 20 years.
Okay, all right. Other questions? Ms. Allenbrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have several questions. Again, I was also looking at what the staff was recommending, and to me seems more in line with some of the other solar farms that are going up around the country. So that was something that I had question on why we changed so much, but I know the chairman already asked that. I had some of the same questions Commissioner Hanslick did, but also I've heard that that there's leakage from the panels that go into the soil and it causes flooding, and so I'd like to have some clarification on that. The other question I have is if somebody, and are you going to look at if there's I was at an event and got an earful from a gentleman who was farming, and he said, "Who are you?" He did call me young lady, so I do appreciate that, but who are you to tell me what I produce on my land, and who are you to tell me that I have to sell my land to any city or any developer to develop housing? I should have the right to produce my own. This is my way of producing for my grandkids, and I can keep my land. So I think we have to be very careful how we dictate that to a landowner. So that might be something that you look at when you're looking at this. The other thing was, I know you talked about disposing of the panels. I've heard comments that they cause waste, they have leakage, and I think Commissioner Hanslick also asked, are they recyclable? I've heard conflicting stories. And then I think I also heard that on the Sunflower property, if they did decide to have, since they've annexed it in, if they did decide to have some solar on there, that if it's within the city and the city decides they want to do that, is something they can do?
Yes, Commissioner, that's the short answer to that question. Jay Leipzig again. I will see if the consultant is available. Darren, are you able to speak?
Let's see if y'all can hear me a little bit better now.
Oh, yes.
Is that better?
Much.
Darren,
better.
If you would like to address the environmental issues, I think I could try, but I'd rather have your expertise on that.
Sure, absolutely. So Darren Coffey with the Berkeley Group, and I have with me Lindsay Edwards and Michael Zahner, and I'll just ask them to chime in if I say something that triggers another idea from their standpoint. I'll first give the disclaimer that I am a land use planner and a land use expert, and not an engineer and not an expert of hazardous materials, but I will give you my opinion based on our experience over the years. Going back to the initial questions, why the 20-year term? Again, we've seen this range from there is no term to a 20-year term. The industry strongly prefers no term because of financing considerations and the size and complexity of these facilities and all of the intricacies that it takes for them to secure the finances, the financial component for these facilities. However, Johnson County, not unlike a lot of other communities around the country, they've got a pretty strong tradition of a 20-year term, and that's for the stated reasons of it's the planning horizon per the comprehensive plan. So these facilities are typically 30 plus years, 40 plus years, really. And so what's the difference between a 20-year term and a 25-year term? I don't know. And that is definitely a consideration for the applicant it is much less of a consideration for the municipality, as was indicated previously. I think these facilities probably are still viable with a 20-year term or a 25-year term, but the preference from the industry is no term. The other question is this a typical size recommendation for an urbanized area? And I would say staff, county staff asked us recently to do some research, which we found to be very interesting. There are an increasing number of these facilities around the country in more urbanized areas. The tendency had been to avoid those areas and do them in more rural areas because the cost of the land, quite frankly, is lower. But with data centers, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, a lot of these companies are driving the locations of facilities to be in more urbanized areas. I would say that the 1,000-acre limit is fairly typical, or I wouldn't say it's a little bit on the large side. I would say 2,000 would be a little bit on the large side for an urbanized area based on the research that we've recently conducted. But the 1,000 acres, to me, that research showed that that size range is probably the right ballpark to be in as a maximum range. And I'll talk more about that. So typical size, there's nothing typical. A lot of the adverse impacts, the potential adverse impacts that staff has gone over in terms of process screening, distance requirements, those are all typical of utility scale solar, regardless of where they're located. It's just when they're located in an urbanizing county like Johnson County, you've got a whole lot of competing land use pressures that more rural counties may not have and typically don't have. And so the size does become a more sensitive issue, because how much of your future land use do you want to be under panel versus competing interests? That is also where the 20-year term comes in, because that gives you the ability to reevaluate the project. It would probably, I would guess, be renewed for another 20-year term, but 20 years is a long time. What were we doing 20 years ago? And what did the land use patterns look like? So from a biased planning perspective, I think it's prudent for an urbanizing county to say at 20 years, are you halfway through the life of this project? Do you still want to continue it as is? What has changed for you? Here's what has changed for us, and does it make sense to continue the relationship? With regard to hazardous materials, to the best of our research knowledge, and we use the North Carolina State Solar Institute, I forget what their exact name is, but we use them a lot for this type of technical knowledge. Any hazardous materials that are in these panels are parts of the components. And it does not leach into the soil. It does not cause groundwater contamination. What does leach from galvanized posts is zinc. There's an oxidation that occurs, and it has been found that higher concentration levels of zinc can go into the ground from panels that have that chemical process occur. If you're a peanut farmer, or you want to be a peanut farmer and your future land use is peanuts, that can be a significant issue. Otherwise, to the best of our knowledge, it is not a significant issue. And the land could be restored similar to its original condition and farmed into the future. These facilities are relatively new. And so the research on a lot of these questions is still emerging. How viable is agricultural activity? How fast would a forest regrow in the area, et cetera, et cetera? And a lot of those questions are still under study. In terms of fire, it hasn't been an issue to our knowledge with panels. I have raised the question in the Southwest of when they have those massive fires, if they sweep through facilities, what does that do? That may become an increasing concern globally with the climate change happening. Battery storage, it is definitely an issue, and the recommendations that we've worked with Johnson County staff on are the best practices with regard to fire safety. And we always recommend a condition in any use permit that's being considered that requires the applicant to work with local public safety officials on what the plan would be in the event that a battery container would catch on fire, or there's an emergency in any solar facility, and how would emergency personnel gain access to that facility? What would their response be? How would they stage, et cetera? How much material is recyclable? The industry will tell you most of it, a lot of it, a significant amount of it. I am not in the salvage business, and I don't believe anyone there is in the salvage business. And that is why we recommend that you retain the full amount of what it would cost to decommission the facility, regardless of what the salvage value would be, and minus of what that proposed number would be. That's going to be to the benefit of the industry or whoever is being hired to decommission the facility at that time, which would be 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, 50 years from now. But supposedly much of the material is recyclable. It's just a matter of where are those facilities and how is the recycling industry at the time that decommissioning occurs. A lot of unknowns there. The other question that I noted was the 1,000 acres versus 2,000 acres. I do feel that the Planning Commission did a good job of pulling that back from 2,000 to 1,000. My opinion is that it would be reasonable to have a 1,000 acre maximum facility with a possibility of a waiver. Maybe a waiver up to a certain amount, like 50% of the maximum size. Or if the Board of Commissioners wanted to be a little more lenient, perhaps the 2,000 acres would be okay with no waiver. So an absolute maximum ceiling. I guess my professional preference would be either 1,000 acres max or 1,000 acres with a waiver. Anytime you build in a waiver, whether it's for size, screening, distance, you're going to get requests for that waiver. So it's a good question to ask, where are we willing to bend on that, and where are we not willing to bend on that? I think I've addressed the question of panel leakage. To the best of our knowledge, there is no hazardous material leakage that comes from these facilities. There is no groundwater contamination that comes from these facilities. Stormwater runoff can be a significant issue. That is why there's a maximum panel coverage of 70% per site. That's why there's screening. That's why we have regulations that talk about the avoidance of wetlands, the implementation of wildlife corridors, the third-party review of stormwater facilities, of erosion and sediment control practices and measures, the third-party review, the third-party inspections of these facilities. When you've got 1,000 acres, that's a lot of area to cover. We also, during a conditional use permit, and we haven't talked about this much during this process because it's already complex enough, but usually when a project comes in, we will look at it and say, based on how this project is laid out, we think it should be done in 3 phases with no more than 400 acres per phase. And so in other words, you're not going to have 1,000 acres of bare soil open. You're going to have 300 to 400, 500 at the most acres open, and then it will be stabilized before you move on to the next phase. So there are ways you can mitigate the effects of stormwater. If a facility is done correctly, it will not increase the stormwater in the area. And I contend that it's possible it can improve the stormwater conditions in certain areas. But it is not to be taken lightly. It is not to be glossed over, or it can cause significant impacts on adjacent property owners if it's not done well. I think I've talked about disposal practices. We just always have conditions that say best available practices. Hopefully those continue to evolve at the federal, state, and local levels, but that's about as good as you do with that. I believe those are the questions that were asked that it was requested our opinion on. Michael, Lindsay, anything you want to add?
I believe you covered it.
All right, and happy to answer any additional questions as they come up.
Mr. Chair.
Let me ask you a couple. You referenced 70% of the acreage would have panels. So if there's 1,000 acres, that means 700, for instance, would have
As a
panels on it?
max. Yes, sir. Panel coverage. Under panel would be a maximum of 700 acres.
Okay. The oxidation, if I've got that correct, of the ground you mentioned, I didn't completely understand that.
Yeah.
The cleanup of that, I guess I would like to have something specific, completely different, but we have had experience of contaminated ground that needs to be cleaned up in this county, and would not want to fall into a situation where it could not be properly and appropriately immediately cleaned up. Is that possible?
I believe so. I mean, I think that's an excellent question to ask an industry representative, either offline or during the public hearing, even though I don't recommend getting into a back and forth with anybody during a public hearing, but that is a good question for the industry to be able to answer. To the best of my knowledge, there are two primary types of posts that either a fixed tilt or a mobile array can go on. And that's either galvanized pipe or aluminum. I think galvanized tends to be sturdier and they can drive them into the ground. And when you have galvanized pipes, when they are when they solder the seam, if it's a fixed tilt, there can be an oxidization at that seam in particular. But galvanized pipes do have some level of oxidization. Again, not a chemist, not an engineer, but that is what can create zinc to leach into the ground. That is the only thing that I'm aware of that has been found to leach into the ground, and that doesn't even need to be mitigated. Again, the only crop that I'm aware of that's sensitive to that is peanuts. So, and I don't think that's a primary crop in Kansas, but we have had a site where that was the case. And they said, we're done with peanut farming. We are on to solar farming. We don't ever want to do peanut farming again, so it's a non-issue. So to the best of my knowledge, that is it. There is no hazardous leakage, groundwater, anything issue that we're aware of with these facilities.
Okay. Commissioner Hensley, you had a question?
Oh, I just wanted to ask Mr. Coffey to clarify a statement he made in regard to the acreage. Did I hear you say that you felt comfortable with 1,000 acres with a waiver or 2,000 without a waiver? Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, I believe that would be reasonable. Although, you know, the Planning Commission's hard line at 1,000 max is not unreasonable either. But yes, I did state what you just said.
Thank you.
Mr. Myers.
Thank you, Chair. My comments, first, the decommission and reclamation is extremely important to make sure that is proper and understood and enforced. Also, protection of our infrastructure, the roads. Again, dealing with other projects as mayor, with the landfill, for instance, the amount of traffic that's increased due to the landfill being situated where it is. I know that protection of infrastructure needs to be written in, and that is important also. My first comment was right along the lines of yours, Chairman, on this CUP of 20 years. I saw a waiver on a couple of the other items and was wondering why there wasn't a possible waiver on the 20-year CUP. I'm understanding what I'm hearing. I don't know enough about finances, the financial part of it, to know whether something's going to be able to be done or not done just based on a 20-year CUP. So that's my comments at this time.
Mr. Ashcraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Miller, thank you for the presentation, you and your staff. Very good job. Couple of observations, if I could. This has been kind of being discussed in the stratosphere for many, many months, well over a year in some sectors. Yesterday was the first time that I was introduced to the substance of the issue, and I've been approached by many people, and I've submitted ex parte standards and refused to talk to people, but have received many communications one way on this issue. And I will tell you, I have started to read the changes in the land use plan. All due respect, it's mind-numbing. Lots of terms of art or jargon. It's going to take me some time to get through it, but I am interested, particularly Ms. Miller, you said this, and I respect it. You indicated, or maybe it was Mr. Lipsick, about using best practices to try to bring forward a plan, and I appreciate those efforts. What I would like to see, and in the discussion I'd like to have with you in the very near future, is systematically go through what both the proponents and opponents of solar farms and what they like and dislike. There are lots of things floating out there. I think several commissioners have raised issues. I've heard all the same things and many, many more. I am a little hesitant to get into it because right now the conversation is fragmented and I don't have a good understanding of what's being proposed. And that's not a reflection on you. You did a very good job of setting the framework. But the one issue that really gives me pause is the issue of the funding or the tax expectations. And I think Commissioner O'Hare and the chair raised that issue, and what we will be asked to do either explicitly or implicitly by taking action on this. I have a certain sensitivity to those issues because I thought we were looking at just land use planning, but if that directly links to tax planning and tax activities, I've got to understand that. And I did not see anything implicitly or explicitly stated in the documents that I received yesterday. If it's in there, I apologize. I missed it.
Okay. All right. Ms. Fass, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to, no disrespect to our consultant, but listening to other land use experts, I've been listening to Douglas County, Jackson County, and 1,000 acres is what they're saying is what was the average about 5 years ago. Kansas City, Missouri is going to put in 2,000 north of us, and Iowa's 3,500, Missouri's 1,500. So I would like to, the land use experts that I've been listening to, because I've been listening to a lot of the area counties, just agree with Mr. Combs. So I would like to have the research where, the current planning that's going on, what we're seeing across the country, the sizes now are 1,500, 2,000, 3,000. They're not, he's giving research from several years ago. So I would like the up-to-date, and that's why staff, I know you recommended 2,000 because you were that recommendation, right, was based on where the industry's been going, like Kansas City, Missouri. They're putting that in next to the airport. North of us in Iowa is 3,500 acres. Central Missouri by an urban area is 1,500. So can you give us, where, in terms of, all these that are in the planning stages, because you obviously based that 2,000 on a reason. You just didn't throw that out, right, Jay?
Yes, Commissioner Vest, Jay Leipzig, I can do that. We, as I said, the idea being whether 2,000 or originally when we had proposed 1,000, it was, in my mind, of thinking it was contiguous. Then we started doing additional research and looking at this Midwestern model, thinking that 2,000 acres would be appropriate. I also want to mention, you mentioned looking at other counties. Douglas County has their proposal, staff recommendation is for a maximum of 1,000 acres, but then the county commission can essentially, with justification, override that. So there's.
But in Douglas County, the 1,000 acres only counts where the solar panel is. So that's a totally different than we're saying, like the chairman said, we're saying 70% of the 1,000. So we're not doing 1,000 acres, we're doing 700, but Douglas County does 1,000 where every panel is. So I just want to say this is apples and oranges when we compared to other areas. Is that correct?
Well, that's why I was mentioning the contiguous item. If 1,000 acres contiguous, which is what Douglas County is proposing, for example, and then so when staff had presented 2,000 acres, that was non-contiguous. So where we still look at that project extent, and then with typical development patterns that we have in the county, where that if they're contiguous like that, that's just that doesn't make sense for us.
And across the country, a lot of farmers are having crops under their solar panels. That's becoming the new innovation. So it's, I think there's a lot of fear, all this land is lost from solar panels, but that's not what's happening. A lot of farmers are using that land for agriculture use too. But that would be a contract between the farmer and the company, right, and the height of their panels so they could have an agriculture use. We don't regulate the height of the panel, or do we?
Commissioner Jay Leipzig, we do regulate the height of the panel. I will say that in terms of if you look at a moving panel, and I'm sure there's a technical term for it, but panels that move and rotate, yes, that's becoming a more common practice. Is other combining growing crops or whatever, or some kind of uses underneath it. If it's a stationary panel, they cannot. But the newer technology is that they rotate.
So our regulations would allow that they could grow crops under it.
This is Karen Miller. So the maximum height of the lower edge of the panel is set at 10 feet for the reason that if you have much higher, that the rainwater, when it runs down the panel, it causes a lot of erosion underneath and stormwater issues. But the way it's written, it does not preclude agriculture. In fact, our consultant has mentioned some areas have like sheep grazing under the panel, but they mentioned things like cattle are too destructive to the actual solar panels.
Well, back to the 70% factor. If you had 1,500 acres maximum, then you're really talking about 1,050 acres of the solar panels, or 2,000, 1,400. So anyway, I think that's something to think about. Yeah.
And
Ms.
the
O'Hara,
purpose of that is to build in that open space.
I'm sorry, what?
And the purpose of that is to build in that open space so that
Right.
you preserve that rural character.
Right.
And not in.
No, that's good. That's good. I'm not complaining about the 70%. I'm just, if we stick with 1,000, then you're really only talking about 700 acres. So, Ms. O'Hara?
If we go with 1,000 acres, it's really taking it's occupying 4 square miles as how we have it laid out now, because it's not contiguous. The 1,000 acres is not contiguous. And so if we go to 2,000 acres, then we are actually impacting 8 square miles. Is that correct?
640 acres.
Well,
per
no,
square mile.
no, it's the way that, it's the rectangle.
This is Karen Miller. And
It's a good farmer.
when we had the 2,000 acre maximum recommendation, we had the 4 square mile project extent. And when the planning commission reduced it to 1,000 acres, they didn't change the 4 square mile project extent.
Okay, so at 2,000 could actually, with it not being contiguous, could fit within 4 square miles? Is that what you're saying?
This is Sean Penley, planning staff. That's correct. The project extent is variable. That is not a set measure. That could be, the maximum we're saying is 4 square miles, but how the facility is developed is what will dictate how large that is. It's kind of difficult to demonstrate that without an actual application, but it's certainly we envision that any one facility should not extend more than a 4 square mile area.
Okay,
And you could still allow theoretically a larger maximum project area, over 1,000 acres, and it still would be subject to that 4 square mile or the maximum, 25, 60 total project extent area.
okay, and then the 2-mile buffer between other solar facilities, does that include in adjacent counties? Or is this visualized that that Douglas County and Johnson County solar farms could be contiguous to each other?
That only applies to unincorporated Johnson County because we don't have control over other jurisdictions.
Okay, so it could reasonably, it could be that the two facilities actually are one. It's just that the county line runs through it, and so our 2-mile buffer would not be in play. Is that correct?
I would say that that's possible. There can really be, none of our regulations can apply to Douglas County and vice versa. So yes, it's possible that a facility could be developed in Douglas County and in Johnson County, and they could be closer
could be
to 2 miles
contiguous.
apart because the jurisdictions have separate regulations.
Yeah, and so when we allow the solar facility not to be contiguous, then what about the landowners that are in between? I mean, are those the folks that are most concerned? That they're basically surrounded by solar farm because it's not contiguous? I'm just asking because I don't know.
I would say, this is Sean Penley, I would say that is possible. That's why the Planning Commission had recommended we research that and provide additional setback requirements or additional regulations to address a situation like that. If a parcel that was not included within the project area was in between 2 parcels that did, and they were not contiguous, that's why we recommended additional setbacks to apply in those common property lines. In those situations, they'd have to have additional setbacks.
Okay, and the 50-foot setback, is that from the center of the road?
There are different setbacks that apply. There's setbacks that apply for the maximum, for the project area. You have a 50-foot minimum setback around the entire
Right, the perimeter. Is that from the center of the road?
So, no. So the 50-foot setback is from the project boundary.
Okay.
And then also it's from the project boundary or the official street line, whichever is closer to the solar facility. So if a project boundary follows a property line that's up against a road, then we would look at either that property line or the official street line and measure the setback from that, which is exactly how we handle setbacks currently for structures in any zoning district.
All right, thank you.
Chair.
Excuse me, Ms. Allenbrand.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I wasn't quite finished. So also I was wondering, so what is the traffic? How much traffic is going in and out?
Commissioner Allen Brown, Jay Leipzig again. I'll address part of that. I don't know exact numbers. I know that you have significant traffic during the construction phase of the facility. So obviously, we would want to ensure there's protections during the initial construction phase with delivery of equipment and as the area is being constructed. After construction, there's really very little traffic impacts at that point. But there again, as I mentioned, we would want to ensure when that site plan was reviewed that we'd look at emergency egress out of the site and access for emergency vehicles to be able to maneuver around and get to all areas of the site efficiently.
So, and who's going to be, is there going to be an inspector inspecting these sites? So is somebody going to be responsible for going out there to see if they're being maintained and when they're actually under construction?
Yes, Commissioner, we would administer it as any other typical construction project where there would be a series of inspections. I would assume in this there would be independent inspections as well, or specialty type inspections to ensure that those connections are made and that things are up to code. But yeah, we administer it like any other construction project where we would be on site reviewing it and then and ensure that everything is functioning properly.
And is this going to lower the cost of to the residents that live around this area with the solar panels? Is this going to help relieve some of the burden of power?
I've thought about that. I don't think you can specifically say that. The power generated will go into the power grid. It's kind of like whether it's a wind turbine out in western Kansas or a solar panel farm somewhere else, our utility may be having access to that power, and that we're already benefiting to a certain extent from that kind of access. So I think to think about the power generated by a solar farm in Johnson County staying in Johnson County is probably not correct. Am I wrong, consultant?
That is a very good answer, and I agree with it completely. Unless you're an electric cooperative or you have a smaller facility that is specifically geared towards serving in a directed area, then you're exactly correct. And utility scale solar is almost always, as you described it, it goes onto the grid, and then where it goes from there is based on demand. So there is no local utility relief on power bills from these facilities.
So also, again, if somebody could get to us the information, if there is TIF money or what they're asking for so that we know the correct answer. And so I think having money in escrow for cleanup or something happens, a company goes out of business, I think that's a great idea. Who, and the chairman may know this, who holds that escrow? Is that in a bank? Is that in the county? Who is making sure, 20 years is a long time, like we said, or 25 years, whatever. If something happens to the property, who is responsible for that?
I think that's my experience in those kind of issues are that is developed at the time of the bond or whatever requirement is put in place. Could be a bank, could be an insurance company, could be a deposit somewhere, I don't know.
Chairman, Jay Leipzig, I will address, just to concur with what you just stated. I think it varies by the project. I know that Rick Lind, our legal counsel, is also on the Zoom call. He might be able to address that as well, but it does vary. But yes, it's usually either a title company or a bank or some other financial institution that carries that bond or the escrow.
Okay, and then this is the last thing. I also want to thank the planning staff, the planning commission, the zoning boards, all the volunteer times that went in, and I know it hasn't been easy no matter what side you're on. I know the amount of emails and information that I've received on both sides of the fence, either pro or against it, so I really appreciate that. And I too, like Mr. Ashcraft, now it's time that I just want anybody to know that please feel free to contact me, and I'll set up meetings now to discuss what their interests are and if they have any suggestions before the public meeting. And then when you have the public meeting, when will that be announced?
Well, we're working on that, and we have a possible date. So we need to talk about date and time of day, and we do have a possible location. So we can talk about that when the discussion is concluded. One thing that I would like to see, and I don't know whether it's a consultant or whether we hire somebody else, but those who are pro discount the concerns about the runoff, the oxidization, or whatever, hazardous materials, and so I would like those questions to be answered before the public hearing. So, from a source that is not does not have an interest,
A dog in the fight.
if you will. So, I think that would be helpful.
Mr. Chairman, a process question.
Yes, Mr. Ashcraft.
I'm sorry. I was going to ask council if we could get some elaboration on ex parte communications related to this process. That's been an issue in previous efforts that we've had to address, Mr. Chairman, and this one definitely has a lot of energy, and I just want to make sure I understand appropriately where the commissioners in our quasi-judicial role should be standing on this issue.
Mr. Chairman, Peg Trent, Chief Counsel, and thank you for that question, Commissioner Ashcraft. As I sat back there and heard Commissioner Allenbrand, I wanted to remind each and every one of you that in this process, right now, it's very critical that you're getting the information as one, and that information, as Jay spoke earlier, is why they've set up a website to put all comments on for you to review into one location. But we're about to have a public hearing, and you're sitting in a different role when you're about to adopt these regulations and or take action on them. And at this point, the safest bet is not to be having ex parte communications at this point. And at this point, I will further elaborate on that in my friendly reminder, getting into specifics, but at this point, it's probably not prudent to go down that path right now.
So, Ms. Trent, so we're not supposed to talk to our constituents that are in our district that have questions and concerns so that we can go back to the public meeting? Because if we're supposed to make a decision.
Correct.
How
You
are
can
we
get,
supposed
the
to-
communication can come in through written, but what's happening is you're getting one piece of information at one level and not to all of you, and so you're not getting the same information. And that's why we're trying to place it all together. And I have an email going out to you about the efforts planning has taken in consultation, is that correct, Jay, with your office, on how we can coordinate all these comments together.
That's correct.
Okay. And we have a process we're going to be putting forward. We just wanted you to get the information today, and it was my intent to immediately send out that process then and kind of discuss this, what you can and can't do.
Counselor, isn't there a difference between this is legislative rather than quasi-judicial? Because we are legislating new regulations.
It's quasi-judicial, as I understand it. Is that right?
Correct. And that's why we're concerned right now. In addition, I am concerned because you will be hearing potentially applications which cannot be commingled. These are regulations in front of you right now.
So you're saying that this is not legislative?
It is legislative, but it's also quasi-judicial. You have a public hearing, you're taking public comments, and I disseminated to you some training material yesterday, and you probably didn't get to it because of your meeting today. But if you would take a look at this journal that I provided you, that really, and that's what Commissioner Ashcraft is acknowledging, it really lays it out really well for you. And I'd rather not go into more detail here publicly, but I'm just trying to give you the restrictions right now carefully as you move forward.
I do have one other question, and this is to staff. Lithium batteries do tend to catch on fire. They are extremely flammable. And so I guess I'm concerned about the fumes, because this is southwest of, possibly west and south, well, would be west, and possibly southwest of residential and, well, populated areas. And I don't know, this is just a question, how do we deal with that? I mean, if we have a fire, we're going to have toxic fumes. And so is that an issue that the fire chiefs have considered?
I think that's one of the, I would call it the hazard questions that need to be specifically answered.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Commissioner O'Hara, Jay Leipzig, yeah, just to reiterate, we did meet with the fire chief and our building official and looking at the fire code issues. However, that's something that is part of their overall review. If something just catches on fire, that the fumes and how to mitigate that is part of that review process.
So I guess I need to know how, because I don't know, how toxic are lithium fumes?
Yeah, we will do some additional research.
Okay, great.
Find out
Thank you.
exactly what is involved with that.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Hanslick, do you have another question?
Yes, thank you. In preparation for this issue, I've tried to educate myself with a lot of reading, and I wanted to get back to a question Commissioner Allenbrand asked about how the oversight of the facility. And it's my understanding that they usually don't require much staffing, so there's not going to be a lot of cars or trucks in and out that perhaps an on-call maintenance person. And my understanding is that there are a lot of control systems in place that provide alerts if something goes wrong, like a fire or something else like that. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Commissioner Hanslick, Jay Leipzig again. Short answer to your question is yes. That's a great question to ask industry representatives, but that is my understanding as well. And staff also had an opportunity to see a farm or a utility scale operation firsthand, and there was, I was amazed at the technology that is available and that's monitored continuously like that. But that would be a great question for the industry.
And just a note that we require any sort of battery energy storage facility to be within a containment center system. So you have the battery, it's in a containment system. It looks like just a regular shipping container. And it also is required to have a management system that continually monitors it. And we also have required inspections. And we also have an emergency preparedness plan as part of the regulations that requires coordination with the applicant and all of the emergency personnel. And that we have it in our regulations, but that is also a requirement of the building and fire codes.
Thank you. I just wanted a follow-up question on that. The chairman asked for information from a disinterested party. I thought that's what the Berkeley Group was. I thought they were our disinterested consultant. Is that correct?
This is Sean Penley, planning staff. The Berkeley Group is a local governmental consulting agency. They are experts in land use planning, regulations. They're not experts in environmental planning. However, they do have experience in reviewing those regulations. So I think, as Mr. Coffey had indicated, he has extensive experience in local land use planning. But if the specific question would be regarding detailed environmental planning or environmental regulations, that may require some additional research. That's something I guess that staff can certainly consult and refer to.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Ashcraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two comments, one about process and one about the land use plan. Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you recall, but about 10 years ago, we had a somewhat similar situation involving a winery where we had to act in a quasi-judicial role, and I remember it well because some of us were not necessarily well-versed and made certain comments, obtained certain conversations, and it causes a certain level of angst as the process develops. And I think the advice of counsel is good. It is unusual for us, but it will potentially avoid us having troubles as this unfolds, regardless of which side you may be on in terms of the conversation. So I just appreciate the counsel of the county attorney. The second thing, Mr. Chairman, and it's related to what Commissioner Allenbrand asked and Commissioner Hanslick and O'Hare expanded upon, because I was have been looking at the land use plan, and for example, under number 11A, it talks about battery storage facilities and requirements to coordinate with local emergency units to maintain conformance with county, state, and federal codes. And the question, you don't have to answer today, but comes to mind is, so do we have that capacity, or is that something we are going to have to develop? Because we cannot look at, or I would submit we should not look at this in isolation. This could be one of a number of facilities, and I don't know what that capacity would require, but I suspect it may not be one that's already existing either in the county or for municipalities and their fire department, their emergency services that might be first responders to that. So it goes to the deeper issue of safety, but also cost. So I look forward to learning more.
Okay. Commissioner Allenbrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate Commissioner
Take your pick.
Ashcraft,
Take your
thank
pick.
you. I appreciate his question, and I appreciate Ms. Trent. I just want to clarify, I wasn't going to be meeting with anybody that's putting in a permit, because I don't know who's going to be putting any land use, but I really appreciate that. So the best thing is to read the email that you have sent us. I was in meetings all day yesterday, so I have not had a chance. And then they're going to have a source where they can provide information. And there may not be any questions after today's, after today's meeting, because they've heard things, but, yeah, it is difficult when people are calling you and so many emails and you can't talk to them, it is.
It's
But thank you, I appreciate you.
It's always been a challenge.
Yeah.
I've had conversations I've tried to outline that I cannot talk about specifics, but I'd be glad to talk about process and, what can happen there, which brings up the subject of process again. Excuse me, Ms. Fast.
We're on the end.
Yeah, I would really appreciate to have, as the chairman asked, expert outside the Berkeley group. I think I've heard a lot of frustrations, and I would like to have someone from the Kansas Corporation Commission, the Energy Office, to talk about the Southwest Power Pool. We do benefit by having this power source that goes into the Southwest Power Pool and how that connection from the wind turbines in Kansas, they're part of that pool. Area farmers saw lessening utility bills. from being located next to wind turbines. So I think we need experts on how transmission and energy works. And so I think that's a question that a lot of people have. How does transmission flow? And that's their expertise at the Kansas Corporation office. And I guess when you're talking about process, so at our meeting, the next meeting, do we say, yes, we agree with planning, no, we agree, and send back? Is it really just a yes, no vote?
No. We have no vote until the public hearing is held.
I know, but after that, I'm saying, once we deliberate.
The commission can alter or endorse the planning commission's
Not
recommendation.
at the first meeting, we can't.
Pardon?
Not at the first meeting. The first.
Following the public hearing. Following the public hearing.
My understanding is either we agree with the planning commission or we send it back. We can't
Well-
waiver it, amend it till after they have a chance.
Well, again, let me go back. Following the public hearing, I would anticipate that this body would make a decision whether to endorse the planning commission recommendation or recommend changes. If you endorse and approve, that's it. If you recommend changes, then it goes back to the planning commission for further consideration, and then comes back to the board with whatever decision the planning commission makes. The second time it comes from the planning commission to the board makes the final judgment in whatever issues they want. So that's the process. Now, as to getting there to the public hearing, there is a suggestion that due to notification processes that we have to complete, that the public hearing be held on Monday, March 4.
April 4?
Yes, April 4th, I'm sorry. We're almost there. April 4th, Monday, April 4th, and that we hold it at the Embassy Suites, which would allow us to have greater participation in person. It would be hybrid. We could receive public comment both in person as well as virtually. The question is, what time of day would we start? I think we need to think in terms of maybe 3 p.m. or 3:30 p.m., something like that. I don't know how many speakers we might have, but 2 minutes apiece to state your opinion. At one of our hearings, we had 60 people. We might easily have 100 people at this hearing. So the public hearing might even go on, 3-4 hours, something like that.
Mr. Chairman?
So, yes, Ms.
I would
O'Hara.
suggest noon.
Noon?
Yeah, so that it doesn't, so that we could get, I mean, even if it would stretch to 6 hours, we would still have a decent time to eat dinner.
Well, yeah, we've talked about that. I guess there is some thought that starting at noon, there would be a lot of people who might have to take a full half day off from work, something like that, and inconvenience them in that regard. So I think that's why the 3 p.m. or 3:30 p.m. If we have to stay there until 8 or 9 o'clock at night, that's the job we ask for. So, any other thoughts? Mr. Ashcraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're not trying to make a decision at this moment in terms of time, are we?
Not necessarily the time, but I
Well-
think we do need to pick a date.
No, and fair enough, and I will be flexible. The time is an issue, and we have to find a balance. If we start too early and get lucky and don't have many comments, then people that have to work would miss out. But if we start too late and it goes long, quite honestly, I've only got so much brain power in trying to make a good decision after 4, 5, 6 hours of deliberation late at night. may not be the best way to make public policy, so.
You've never had to make a decision at 12:30 a.m. or?
And
or-
my
or-
wife has made me
or 1
regret it
a.m.?
many
Yeah, I was
times.
gonna say. Mr.
Chairman, this is Penny.
Yes.
County Manager. And the sooner we could decide on the time would be helpful because we do have publication notification time. And so Jay, you might give us, when's the latest we could decide? We also need to secure an offsite facility, which we have on hold for this day. So the sooner we could get a time scheduled would help us all in the notification.
Yeah,
How about
okay.
1:30? Start at
Pardon?
1:30.
I'm sorry?
How about start at 1:30?
Well, that might be possible. Again, I still prefer 3 or 3:30 myself, but
1:30, so we have
it's up,
enough
it's up to anybody. Yeah, Ms. Allenbrand?
I kind of would agree with you, Mr. Chair, just because I know people work, and there's a lot of interest around this. So I know the charter started at 4, and I know that some of our planning meetings, they have, what, 4:45?
Commissioner 5:45 is,
Maybe somewhere between 3 and 4.
Not that late, no.
Okay. Well, the suggestion is 3 or 3:30 p.m. or 1:30 p.m.
What's the difference to make it 2?
Yeah, let's
There you
do that.
go.
Pardon?
Do 2.
2 o'clock.
Let's do
Make it
2.
2. What's the difference to make
No,
it 2?
do it at 2. That's
Can we
fine.
do 2:30?
No. Let's do
2:15, do I hear 2:15?
Yeah, 2:40.
Well, I'm going to suggest that we start the public hearing at 3 p.m. There will be virtual opportunities, so that might, those who have other obligations and want to speak, that would be an option. You know, I'm thinking about, in our normal process with virtual comments, at the public comment, we take all the virtual comments first. But I'm thinking that maybe we do 30 minutes of virtual, 30 minutes of in-person, so that we can kind of split the time, and somebody comes in person and has to wait 2 hours until the virtual comments get done. That's just my thought.
Mr. Chair, I would agree with that.
So, well, let me, do I hear a motion for 3 p.m.? Do I hear any motion?
I'll make a motion for 2.
Pardon?
I'll make a
All right, Ms. Fass made a motion for 2 p.m. Is
I
there a
second
second
it.
for that?
I second it.
There is a second for 2 p.m. Any further discussion?
Would you make an amendment to 2:30?
Well, an amendment would be in order, but, or could be done, but anyway,
Myers?
yes, Mr.
I
Myers.
would just say, because there is going to be virtual involved, I think that helps an awful lot of people that won't be able to be there, whether it's because of work or not. And if it is because of work, they're going to, you know, it's important enough to them. They're going to be there, whether it's, you know, they have to be at work or not. They're going to have time off or work something out with their employer. But because of virtual, I think being able to, the 2 o'clock start works fine, because those people will have the opportunity to speak virtually.
Yeah, they could come in on phone. Easy.
All right, well, the motion before us is to begin the public hearing at 2 p.m. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Fast. Commissioner Myers.
Myers, aye.
Commissioner O'Hara.
Yes.
Commissioner Hanslick.
Hanslick, aye.
Commissioner Ashcraft.
Sure.
Commissioner Allenbrand.
Allenbrand, aye.
And Chairman Eilert.
Eilert, aye, so I have 7 votes in favor. 2 p.m. will be the start time, and it will be on Monday, April 4th at Embassy Suites.
And Chairman, this is Penny again, County Manager. Just want to do full disclosure. I don't think this will change your mind at all, and I'm not suggesting that it should. I just want you to be aware that
Hey, you
that
won't be
evening
in the
at 8
finals.
It's 8 o'clock. It's the National Championship basketball game. If
I'm
anybody
sorry.
wants to know that.
I'm sorry, that's not a factor. So
Well, since we're meeting,
the
they will be in
obligations,
the
the
final.
obligations a tower taller than that entertainment opportunity. Okay, well, any questions, Mr. Leipzig?
No, sir. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, you know, I know the staff has put in a
Thank
great amount of
you.
time on this question, as well as the Planning Commission, so thank you all very much. We are adjourned.